Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Sony are back in the computer monitor market with their brand new, just announced Inzone series, and today we'll be testing out the highest spec model, the Inzone M9. Back in the day, Sony were a massive name in computer displays with their Trinitron series of CRTs, but haven't exactly done heaps in the LCD era. Well, that changes today because not only is Sony back in the gaming monitor market, they're doing so with a monitor that offers unique features that I haven't seen before. At first glance, the Inzone M9 spec sheet points to a typical high-end gaming display, 27-inch panel size, 4K resolution, IPS technology, and up to a 144Hz refresh rate with standard adaptive sync variable refresh features. It also comes display HDR 600 certified, 1 millisecond rated response times, all the usual stuff that you'd expect in this class. But this isn't just a regular 4K 144Hz monitor because Sony have put real effort into improving one key area over its competitors, HDR. You see, most monitors like this come with poor HDR capabilities. Edge-lit local dimming, or just no local dimming at all, are commonplace despite companies often achieving display HDR 600 certification. That's not the case with the Inzone M9. This monitor packs full array local dimming with 96 zones, taking us a big step forward in HDR hardware for this class of display. Now, 96 zones isn't heaps of zones, it's not the 1000 plus we see from flagship monitors, but with the Inzone M9 we're finally getting a meaningful improvement to basic HDR hardware for gamers, and I hope it means the death of pathetic edge-lit dimming. Sony are offering this hardware for no more than you'd pay for other high-end 4K monitors like the LG 27GP950 that we've previously talked about. That is to say, it will hit store shelves for $900 US in the next month or so, giving buyers the first sub $1,000 4K gaming monitor with full array local dimming of any kind. So let's see how it stacks up and performs. A quick interruption to today's review just to briefly mention Monitors Unboxed, our brand new second channel where we'll be diving more deeply into monitor content. So if you're interested in more monitor and display stuff from us here at Hardware Unboxed, please do subscribe to Monitors Unboxed. We'll put links in the description below for you. I also have to give credit to Sony for trying something a bit unique with the design. While this is intended as a computer display first and foremost, it's clear that the style has been influenced by Sony's PlayStation 5, with the curved white sections providing a contrast to the otherwise black plastic build. It basically looks like a PlayStation monitor and will complement that sort of setup nicely, plus it has some PS5 specific integrations like auto HDR tone mapping and auto picture mode selection. The overall design is quite understated and has a more pleasant aesthetic than a lot of other gaming monitors. I like the slim bottom edge bezel on the front and the clean rear section. Sony have integrated an RGB LED light bar along the back, which isn't the most useful inclusion, but it fits in well with the design. Overall, it's reasonably well built too, like I would expect in this sort of price tier. The unique design does bring its own set of challenges. Most monitors that use a tripod stand put the straight leg at the rear and the V section at the front. Sony flips this around, which gives the Inzone M9 its unique look. The straight leg comes forward while the V is at the back providing support. I don't mind how this looks, but it does limit the ergonomic capabilities. Height adjustability is included, for example, but the maximum height just isn't very high at all compared to most monitors I've tested. The stand also makes it hard to support swivel and pivot adjustment, so those aren't included here either. Luckily, you can VESA mount it. For inputs, the Inzone M9 comes with DisplayPort 1.4 with DSC, USB-C supporting DP alt mode, and two HDMI 2.1 ports, plus a smattering of other USB ports. DisplayPort is obviously fine for running the monitor up to 144Hz at 4K, but the HDMI ports are a bit interesting. Both support 40 gigabits per second of bandwidth, which is fully sufficient for 10-bit 4K 144Hz, so no issues here at all, and you'll get full compatibility with consoles like the PS5. However, Sony hasn't enabled a 144Hz refresh rate over HDMI for whatever reason. It's limited to 120Hz even on PC, which seems to be more of a firmware limit than a hardware limit. I'd like to see 144Hz enabled for PC gamers over HDMI 2.1 via a firmware update, as the ports should have the bandwidth for it. As for the OSD, Sony has thankfully included a directional toggle and their interface is easy to navigate. For a first re-entry to the gaming monitor market, it's surprisingly feature-packed, including all the options that most brands offer these days, such as crosshairs, frame rate counters, black equalizers, and even a KVM switch. The main omission here is that there's no backlight strobing support, which is difficult with an FALD backlight, but will no doubt be disappointing for those that like using strobing to increase motion clarity. Speaking of motion clarity, let's take a look at response time performance. Sony provides 3 overdrive settings, the first and default setting being standard, which at 144Hz provides a 9 millisecond response time average. Do note here that we are testing with local dimming disabled for now, so this represents how the LCD performs without any backlight adjustments and is closest, in my opinion, to how the display will operate most of the time. No overshoot here, so we're looking at overdrive disabled behavior, and performance is only okay for 144Hz. Moving up to the fast mode at 144Hz, now we're in business. The response time average has fallen to 5.24 milliseconds, and cumulative deviation is also good at right on the 500 mark that we like to see. There is a small increase to overshoot, but this won't be noticeable while gaming, making the fast mode the best mode to choose for high refresh gaming on this panel. Meanwhile, the faster mode is really only included so that Sony can advertise a 1 millisecond greater grey response time. Not a fan of this practice, as to achieve a best case response around 1 milliseconds, the display produces a high amount of overshoot and cumulative deviation becomes worse than the previous mode, so for practical use this mode is not recommended. For gaming using a variable refresh rate, the fast mode is also my preferred mode. Performance holds up really nicely, even down to 85Hz, where this very same mode is still usable and delivers around that 5 millisecond response average. At 60Hz, the fast mode is okay and still usable, though some inverse ghost trails are visible in practice. If you're really concerned about this, you can drop the overdrive mode to standard, which removes these faint trails at the cost of speed, but I'd only recommend doing this for gaming at a locked 60Hz. Variable refresh gamers will still benefit from the fast mode, particularly at higher refresh rates. Based on this testing, I'd say for the most part, the Inzone M9 does have a single overdrive mode experience, in that variable refresh gamers don't need to adjust the overdrive settings to get the best experience across most of the refresh rate range. The only exception to this is playing specifically at 60Hz, but I'd be comfortable using the fast mode for all my gaming needs. As for what happens when the FALD backlight is enabled, this becomes a more complicated discussion, as the response behavior you'll see is not only dictated by a specific pixel, but by the pixels around it that encompass the local dimming zone. Both the backlight and the LCD layer work in tandem to produce the response and change in color value. What this creates is a chart that looks like this. What we're seeing here is effectively the worst case scenario, where the entire local dimming zone is a single color value that changes. In reality, what the backlight zone does will be dictated by an image processing algorithm, and most of the time the transitions aren't going to be as bad. But in these worst case scenarios, you'll spot some interesting behavior. When the RGB value is close to or at 0, this is when the backlight does the most work, and we see a big increase in response times. This is because the LCD transition and backlight transition aren't perfectly in sync. The delay between each element beginning to transition causes response times to elongate. There are also some areas where the FALD backlight does some of the transition work, but not as much as a transition from full black, such as these areas here and here. There were also a few transitions with odd behavior that were too difficult to measure, which I've omitted. But then for some other transitions, the FALD backlight effectively does nothing, and so the main response time is dominated by the LCD layer's speed. The big question is whether the FALD system affects motion clarity while gaming. When using this display for gaming, I'd say for the most part you'll see transitions more like the earlier charts, where the backlight is only making minor adjustments that don't have a significant effect on response times. However, there are some times, particularly when an entire zone changes from bright to dark, that you can feel the display is a bit slower with local dimming enabled, in this case set to high. I don't think this slowdown outweighs the benefits of having local dimming, and in any case if you're concerned about speed, for example if you're playing, say, a competitive game, you can simply disable local dimming to get the best performance on offer. Compared to other displays, and these are the results with local dimming disabled, the Sony Inzone M9 sits in the middle of the chart for the best performance at the maximum refresh rate. This result is very similar to many other of today's best normal gaming IPS panels, which typically vary between 4 and 6 milliseconds for response times. Factoring in overshoot, the M9 is pretty similar to products like the Samsung Odyssey G7 S28 and Asus VG28 UQL1A, which are both 4K 144Hz monitors. And it's good to see that performance is actually better than some other premium HDR monitors like the Acer Predator X27 from several years ago and the newer and very expensive Asus PG32 UQX. Average performance is very solid, again sitting close to other 4K 144Hz monitors that I've tested and better than previous products like the PG32 UQX and Predator X27. The advantage the Inzone has is lower overshoot across the refresh range than competitors such as the M28U and Odyssey G7 S28, even if response times are slightly worse. We also see a superior experience to LG's 27GP950 and the Eve Spectrum 4K, which occupy a similar price point. This is because the Inzone M9 has tighter control across the refresh range and a better single overdrive mode experience, more in line with the new 28-inch series of displays using Interlux panels. For average cumulative deviation, the Inzone M9 is a pretty typical monitor that I think is quite competitive with other displays. The best offering here from a similar monitor type is the MSI MAG281URF, which has 12% better cumulative deviation across the refresh range. This isn't noticeable in real-world usage, so the M9 ends up with a decent result, especially as it doesn't end up on the side of overshoot. However, performance is 20% better than the Predator X27 and 42% better than the PG32 UQX, which are more noticeable numbers, especially in the case of the PG32 UQX. So among FALD options, this display is very respectable. At a fixed 120Hz, the Inzone performs well, similar in response times to other options, but with lower overshoot and therefore less inverse ghosting. This is especially good news for PlayStation 5 gamers looking to utilize the 120Hz mode over HDMI 2.1. As for fixed 60Hz gaming, I recommend reducing the overdrive setting to standard, which does see the Inzone M9 fall down the charts a bit. A mode between fast and standard could have been better optimized for 60Hz gaming, and I'd say this is somewhat of a weakness compared to the 28-inch models at the top of the chart. For input latency, the Inzone M9 is a typical monitor in that its processing delay with local dimming disabled is less than 1 millisecond, in line with the majority of other displays in this chart. Like with a lot of 144Hz monitors, the main limiting factor for latency is not the amount of time it takes for the display to process, but the modest refresh rate. Choosing a 240Hz display over 144Hz will help in this area. However, I should note here that if you do enable local dimming, the processing delay increases to about 8 milliseconds. For competitive gaming that's, latency sensitive, I would recommend keeping the FALD backlight off, though for single player games using the panel's HDR capabilities, 8 milliseconds of lag is certainly playable. Despite featuring an FALD backlight, power consumption is very reasonable. A lot of this can be attributed to the lack of an NVIDIA G-Sync module, which has been used previously for most FALD gaming monitors. While not a huge deal in the grand scheme of things, I was impressed with this result. And just quickly before we move on to color performance, here's a quick look at the UFO test results. The M9 doesn't support backlight strobing, but our Discord community members would assassinate me if I didn't include this visual guide. Moving now to color performance, the Sony Inzone M9 sports a wide color gamut with 97% coverage of the DCI P3 color space, a good result for people wanting to use both the standard sRGB and also P3 color spaces for work or content consumption. There's also good oversaturation potential if that's how you like your display to look. However, you won't see amazing Adobe RGB color space coverage here, and in total this monitor tops out with 72% coverage of the very wide Rec 2020 color space. This is better than most of the 28-inch monitors we've tested, and similar to an OLED like the LG C1, but it falls short of very wide gamuts seen from displays such as the PG32 UQX. In terms of out-of-the-box accuracy, Sony has made no attempt whatsoever to configure the default settings to be color accurate. This is mostly due to Sony's decision to use a 7500K plus white balance, which throws off the results and gives the display a blue, cold tint overall. Along with an oversaturated image in this default mode, the general accuracy without performing any tweaks is poor. For example, it's in the bottom handful of monitors seen here for grayscale calibration, and similar for color checker, which is pretty disappointing. However, the situation can be improved slightly by changing the monitor to its standard mode, which does lock you out of several color controls. In this mode, the white balance is significantly improved and leads to better Delta E performance, but it's not an sRGB mode. In fact, the Inzone M9 does not include an sRGB mode at all. So oversaturation is still present here, which limits color checker Delta E's, and the only way to fix this is via a full calibration or using sRGB clamping software utilities. Sony really should be offering an sRGB mode here that can be applied to any type of input. I think this is a very important inclusion on wide gamut displays. With that said, the standard mode is actually quite well calibrated for D65P3, with Delta E ITP averages below 5.0 across the various tests we perform. Sony claimed this display is factory calibrated, but didn't go into specifics on what gamut it's calibrated to. I would say that factory P3 calibration is good enough to advertise that feature. However, as sRGB is the default color space in Windows, which is used for the vast majority of gaming setups, really it should be factory calibrated to sRGB, or at least include an sRGB display profile. Calibrated performance is very solid as the Inzone M9 has full sRGB coverage, and the gamma profile by default isn't too far off accurate, so not a heap needs to be adjusted. P3 accuracy can also be great after calibration, though the top end of greens isn't featured strongly here, which is a small issue. Our calibration here was performed using CalMan, and we provide ICC profiles for our Patreon members via links in the description below. Maximum brightness in the SDR mode is strong at nearly 500 nits. This isn't the full brightness capabilities of the panel, but plenty for most use cases, especially when combined with a matte screen coating that's effective at cutting down reflections. Minimum brightness is exceptional at just 10 nits, which is so dim it's almost unusable in most situations except pitch black rooms, so having that sort of flexibility is a welcome bonus. As for the panel's native contrast ratio with local dimming disabled, this IPS is capable of 1100:1, which is slightly above average for this type of panel. Local dimming is available for the SDR mode though, so you can enable that if you want, even outside HDR apps. However, in what ends up being quite annoying, the local dimming setting is universal and applies to both the SDR and HDR modes. So if you disable dimming for SDR, it will also disable for HDR and vice versa. These should be separate settings, so we can have dimming disabled for SDR use but enabled when the HDR mode is activated. I'd like to see this changed in a firmware update. Uniformity is average and I believe is affected to a small degree through choosing FALD over a more traditional backlight. My unit did have a bit of vignetting around the edges, as you can see from this uniformity chart, although the center section was decent. The big question mark I had going into this review is how effective the HDR hardware is. Sony are offering a step up from edge-lit dimming panels that we usually see in this price tier, instead offering 96 full array local dimming zones in what appears to be a 12x8 grid. However, this is a relatively low zone count, with the best HDR capable LCDs pushing the zone count into the thousands, assisting with blooming and haloing in HDR content. If we look at the HDR checklist, the Inzone M9 passes all criteria except having plenty of local dimming zones. I think it's too harsh to call this a semi-HDR monitor, given that its HDR hardware is better than edge-lit panels that I've described as semi-HDR previously. But I also think the M9 falls short of being a full true HDR panel. The best way I can describe the Inzone M9's HDR is like a basic HDR mode. The minimum level I think provides an upgrade over a regular SDR panel in most circumstances. Edge-lit semi-HDR monitors only provide an upgrade some of the time, whereas this basic HDR panel I feel delivers an upgrade most of the time, just the upgrade is limited in several ways. First, let's talk about the advantages to 96 zone locally dimmed HDR. Compared to an edge-lit panel, we are getting 5 to 10 times the number of zones. This significantly assists the display's ability to dim certain areas of the display. With an edge-lit panel, everything in a vertical strip from the bottom to the top of the display determines the dimming level for that zone. So if something needs to be bright in that zone, the entire section will have to illuminate, and that causes raised blacks. Huge zones equals huge areas of raised blacks, and often with edge-lit dimming, what ends up happening is that most of the zones have to illuminate, which destroys the black level, contrast, and overall HDR effect. It's only in certain circumstances where this type of dimming can have a benefit, hence why we describe these panels as semi-HDR. A lot of the time, all the zones are lit, the dimming system has no benefit, and we don't end up with a true HDR experience. With 96 zone FALD, each vertical section that an edge-lit panel may have now has basically 8 horizontal sections. This means that something can be bright in just one of these sections without significantly affecting the other zones, including content in the middle of the display. Compared to an 8 edge-lit zone panel, 96 zone FALD gives us an order of magnitude better control over dimming. As a result, darker areas get darker and closer to how they should be, 2 to 3 times dimmer in my measurements than the edge-lit LG 27GP950 in real-world content. It also assists with general accuracy across the panel, not just for dark areas, as the FALD system has a better ability to show a variety of brightnesses at the same time. This allows content to look much closer to how it should in many circumstances, bright or dark. However, with such a low zone count as far as FALD systems go, there are also plenty of downsides. The zones are still large, so when viewing content with small bright details, you'll see plenty of blooming and haloing. In especially tricky scenes like star fields or Christmas lights, the zones simply aren't small enough to illuminate just the light sources, so large sections of the display are lit and we see noticeably raised blacks. As you might expect, the level of control 96 zones has is not as good as 384 or 512 zone panels, let alone the top tier 1000 plus zone panels. This limits the HDR experience to a pretty basic level, as many scenes aren't well suited to large zone dimming. Despite these issues, when gaming on the Inzone M9, I felt the HDR experience was visually superior to any edge-lit panel that I've seen and reasonable for entry-level HDR content consumption. While I wouldn't necessarily pay any extra money to go from no dimming to edge-lit dimming as the experience isn't very good, I do think that the Inzone M9's FALD system is worth a small price premium. Currently, you have to spend well over $1,000 to get better HDR in a monitor form factor, or opt for a TV, so I'm comfortable with what Sony are offering at this price. Let's explore what the Inzone M9's HDR is capable of. For full screen brightness, this panel is very strong, reaching over 800 nits sustained. There is no difference between peak and sustained brightness for this monitor, so comparatively it isn't as good for flash brightness, but still much better than other Display HDR 600 tier products. Interestingly though, the Inzone M9's brightness is actually lower for 10% window sizes than it is for full screen. Usually it's the opposite. The M9 is still capable of nearly 700 nits here, but that's similar to other monitors in this tier. When looking at brightness versus window size, you can see this play out, where brightness falls to around 500 nits for small details, likely to prevent blooming as this window size is smaller than a zone. For full screen flash contrast, the Inzone M9 delivers great results as the monitor can get quite dim when showing a full black image. However, its best case single frame contrast is more limited, and this is why I wouldn't necessarily describe this as a full true HDR display. While the result of 18,505 to 1 is much higher than the panel's native contrast ratio, ideally HDR displays would be pushing above 50,000 to 1. This would allow 600 nits and 0.01 nits to be displayed at the same time, giving us access to most of the low luminance range in HDR content. As it stands, this result is generally higher than most edge-lit panels, twice as good as the Odyssey G7 or LG 27GP950 for example, but similar to others like the AW2721D. The main advantage over edge-lit is you'll more often see this best case contrast in practice with the Inzone M9, whereas with edge-lit panels it's pretty rare. For our worst case tests, the 96 zone local dimming provides a limited benefit over native contrast as the zones are too large. When measuring a bright and dark area close together, the Inzone M9 is only capable of contrast 50% better than native. That's similar to the 384 zone Predator X27, which also has zones that are too large by modern standards, but behind the best FALD displays of today, like the PG32UQX and Odyssey Neo G9, both of which are capable of 5 times their native contrast using local dimming. Then for the checkerboard test, there is virtually no advantage to local dimming, which is not the case for a premium HDR display like the PG32QX. Whether or not that's worth an extra $2,000 is up to you. Naturally, the best technology for any of these contrast tests is OLED, which has per pixel local dimming. As for HDR accuracy, when testing using the high local dimming mode, I was disappointed to see elevated blacks for a portion of the luminance range. While this display handles high brightness well and has appropriate roll-off around 700 nits, we're testing with a 10% window here, dark elements can often be shown brighter than they should be, with the exception of extremely dark content. I'm not sure whether this is deliberate to mitigate the effects of a low zone count, but I'd like to see it corrected with a firmware update. The low local dimming setting isn't any better really, just in case you were wondering. Outside of grayscale tracking though, the HDR results are reasonable. We get a decent white point and okay saturation tracking inside the color gamuts the monitor can actually support. Not perfect, but fine for gaming and content consumption. Final section of this review is the Hub Essentials checklist, which looks to see whether Sony is accurately advertising the panel and whether it meets minimum performance standards. This was a bit trickier than usual as Sony are announcing this display when the review goes live, so I've measured against what Sony told us ahead of time. The Inzone M9 flies through the two first sections thanks to including true HDMI 2.1 and delivering performance in line with their claims for areas like color space and calibration. I'm not sure whether this is a true 10-bit panel or 8-bit plus FRC, but either is good enough. Unfortunately, the lack of an sRGB mode is disappointing here. In the motion section, Sony are misleading customers when suggesting this panel is capable of 1 millisecond response times. This is possible in the highest overdrive setting, but practically speaking that mode is unusable. It would be more accurate to describe this as a 5 millisecond monitor. Sony also get docked for not including backlight strobing, though other areas are solid. Then for HDR, as we've been talking about, I think the HDR Performance qualifies for basic HDR, though its performance could be better as seen from several penalties. Luckily though, I spotted no panel defects like flickering even in the HDR mode, though I'm not sure whether the firmware is user upgradable. Overall, I think the Inzone M9 is an impressive re-entry for Sony into the gaming monitor market. Sony has a long history of producing quality CRTs and TVs, and I think that expertise has played a part into nailing many aspects to this display's performance and features. They clearly understand what it takes to be competitive in 2022, with their first offering including things that other brands may not consider for their first product like a KVM switch. The key selling point and unique feature to the Inzone M9 is its HDR capabilities, specifically its 96-zone FALD backlight. I think this has been successful to some degree, offering a better HDR experience than edge-lit panels, enough that I would class this as a basic HDR monitor. Yes, the zone count is relatively low and that causes issues compared to premium HDR displays, but for a monitor priced below $1,000 US, Sony are offering us more than we've ever gotten before. Unlike almost every other fake or semi-HDR product that came before it, I think this level of HDR is worth paying a small premium for. This display doesn't sacrifice on other areas to give us basic HDR. Motion performance is just as good as other 4K 144Hz gaming monitors of today, including its single overdrive mode experience, so we're not getting a last-gen panel or anything like that. Sony also provide a wide color gamut equivalent to other options and nail some of the key features you need in a product like this, such as HDMI 2.1 with VRR. There's even a few PS5 specific features for gamers after this as a console monitor. While I do like this display a lot, there are several areas where Sony has missed a trick. The lack of an sRGB mode and poor factory calibration for SDR content means you'll need to mess around a bit to get accurate colors. The HDR mode's dark level performance could also do with a bit of tweaking, and in general there are a few oddities. The design, while unique and intended to match the style of the PlayStation 5, also has limited ergonomic adjustability. The big question is whether the Inzone M9 is worth paying $900 for, the same price as LG's 27GP950 or the Eve Spectrum 4K. Given the addition of an FALD backlight, I think the Inzone M9 is a better product than either of these models, unless there's a specific feature you need such as the sRGB mode. But on the whole, for your $900, Sony are offering you more as you're getting a basic HDR experience versus an inadequate HDR experience. But is it worth $300 more over the Gigabyte M28U, which is currently available as a 28-inch 4K 144Hz SDR-only monitor for a touch under $600 US? That's a tough one, as Sony are asking for 50% more, essentially to get the 96-zone backlight and a few other small additions. I think it's $750 or $800 instead of $900, that would be a very compelling price, but the $300 difference just feels a bit too much to me. On the flip side, there aren't any other 4K 144Hz monitors below $1,000 offering this level of HDR, so it's hard to criticize the price too much when there isn't a direct competitor right now, and I certainly think for a lot of buyers, especially those people interested in HDR, you could, in some circumstances I guess, justify that price difference. Anyway, that's it for this look at the Sony Inzone M9, perhaps a more interesting monitor than I was expecting when Sony first told me that they were going to be producing a monitor. So yep, big shout out to our Patreon and Float Plane members that allow us to test these sorts of products and spend a lot of time working on reviews like this. Don't forget about Monitors Unboxed. If you're interested in more monitor content from us, please do head over there and subscribe to that. But apart from that, thanks for watching and I'll catch you in the next one.